Sir, I need you to step aside. You're not boarding this aircraft tonight. The words cut through the humid Miami air like a blade slicing through the Tuesday evening rush at Gate B-47. Derek Hoffman, senior TSA security supervisor, stood with his arms crossed, his badge catching the harsh fluorescent light as he blocked the jet bridge entrance. His voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, no questions asked. Behind him, Delta Flight 22847 to London sat at the gate engines, humming softly, passengers already settling into their seats. The departure board showed 7:23 p.m. on-time departure in 12 minutes. But for the man standing at the front of the boarding line, those 12 minutes were about to stretch into something much longer and far more significant. Before we dive into this story, let me ask you something. Have you ever been stopped and questioned when you had every right to be somewhere? Have you ever felt the sting of assumption based on nothing more than how you look? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe respect has no color and dignity has no dress code, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next at Miami International Airport will remind you why speaking up matters and why silence isn't always golden. The man Derek was addressing stood quietly holding a boarding pass in one hand and his phone in the other. Marcus Rodriguez Johnson was 42 years old, though the stress of building a global consulting empire had etched a few extra lines around his dark eyes. He wore dark jeans, clean but well-worn Nike sneakers, and a plain gray hoodie with the hood down. A black baseball cap sat backwards on his head, and a simple black backpack hung from his left shoulder. To anyone watching, he looked like a million other travelers trying to get home after a long business trip. What they couldn't see was the man beneath the casual clothes. What they couldn't know was that Marcus Rodriguez Johnson was a senior partner at Meridian Global Consulting, one of the most powerful airport logistics firms in the world. His personal net worth topped $280 million. His signature appeared on contracts that kept international airports running smoothly across 4 continents. His business decisions affected the daily lives of millions of travelers. But Derek Hoffman saw none of that. He saw a black man in casual clothes holding a first-class boarding pass, and something in his gut told him that didn't add up. "Excuse me, Marcus?" asked his voice, quiet but steady. He'd learned long ago that the first response to confrontation should never be escalation. "I have my boarding pass right here. Seat 2A. Derek glanced at the boarding pass without really looking at it. "I'm going to need you to step over here for additional screening." He gestured toward a small area beside the gate podium. "Random selection." Random. The word hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had heard it before. He'd heard it when he was 23, trying to enter a corporate event where he was the youngest senior analyst in attendance. The security guard had looked at his lanyard, looked at his face, and said he needed additional verification, that he belonged in the executive conference room. Marcus had stood there for 15 minutes while white colleagues walked past without a second glance until his boss finally came looking for him. He'd heard it again at 31 when airport security in Chicago had randomly selected him for extra screening on 3 consecutive business trips. Each time they'd asked him whose company credit card he was using. Each time they'd questioned whether the business cards in his wallet were really his. Each time they'd made him miss his flight while they verified information they could have confirmed with a simple computer check. But Marcus had learned something important in those moments of humiliation. He'd learned that fighting fire with fire only created bigger fires. He'd learned that quiet dignity was a more powerful weapon than loud outrage. And he'd learned that the people with the power to change things were usually watching from the sidelines, waiting to see how situations played out before they chose a side. "Random selection," Marcus repeated, nodding slowly. Of course. Behind Derek, the gate area was filling with passengers. Maria Gonzalez, the gate agent, looked up from her computer screen with concern creasing her forehead. She'd been working for Delta for 6 years, and she knew Derek's random selections weren't random at all. In her time at Gate B-47, she'd seen him pull aside 17 passengers for additional screening. 15 of them had been people of color. but speaking up against security meant putting her job at risk, and she had 2 kids to feed. Near the back of the boarding line, James Rivera pulled out his phone. He'd been traveling for work for 15 years, and he recognized the pattern unfolding in front of him. As a Hispanic man who'd built his own social media marketing company from nothing, he understood the power of documentation. His finger hovered over the Instagram Live button as he watched Derek escort Marcus to the side. "Something's happening here at MIA." James whispered to his phone camera. "Gate B47. Y'all need to see this." Sarah Kim, a 26-year-old business consultant traveling to London for a client meeting, stood 3 people behind James in line. She watched the interaction with growing unease. She'd been on the receiving end of discrimination herself, questioned at hotels and restaurants about whether she really had reservations. Something about Derek's posture, the way he was treating Marcus like a suspect rather than a passenger, made her stomach turn. Robert Taylor, a 52-year-old insurance executive from Atlanta, had a different reaction. He'd been traveling first class for 20 years, and he'd seen his share of people trying to game the system. Fake tickets, stolen credit cards, elaborate scams. From where he stood, Derek was just doing his job. Security was important, even if it occasionally inconvenienced people. Better safe than sorry, he thought. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some additional identification," Derek said, pulling out a small tablet. "And I'll need to verify your ticket purchase." Marcus reached into his back pocket and produced his wallet. His driver's license showed his full name, Marcus Antonio Rodriguez Johnson. His address was listed in Coral Gables, one of Miami's most expensive neighborhoods. He handed the license to Derek, along with his boarding pass. Derek studied the documents with exaggerated care, as if he were examining evidence at a crime scene. "Marcus Rodriguez Johnson," he read aloud, mispronouncing both the Rodriguez and emphasizing each syllable like it was foreign. "That's quite a name." "It's my name, Marcus," replied simply. "Where'd you get the ticket?" Derek asked, his finger scrolling across his tablet screen. "I purchased it." "When?" "3 days ago. Online. Through my corporate travel agent." Derek looked up from the tablet. "What company?" "Meridian Global Consulting." "Never heard of it." Derek's tone suggested that if he hadn't heard of a company, it probably wasn't worth knowing about. "What do you do there?" Marcus paused. He could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him. The boarding line had stalled, and passengers were starting to crane their necks to see what was happening. He could hear James whispering into his phone camera, and he could see Sarah Kim taking discreet photos with her device. "I'm a senior partner," Marcus said. Derek laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but an actual laugh. "Senior partner, at 42, in consulting." He looked Marcus up and down, taking in the casual clothes, the backpack, the absence of a briefcase, or any visible signs of wealth. "Right." Bradley Morrison, the Delta Gate supervisor, had been watching the interaction from behind the counter. He was 45 years old, had worked for Delta for 22 years, and prided himself on avoiding confrontation whenever possible. His job was to get planes out on time and customers satisfied, not to referee disputes between security and passengers. But the boarding process had stopped, and he was getting nervous about the departure delay. "Is there a problem here?" Bradley asked, approaching Derek and Marcus. "Just verifying some information," Derek replied. "This passenger's story isn't adding up." "What story?" Marcus asked. "I showed you my ID and boarding pass. I answered your questions." "What exactly isn't adding up?" Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by passengers who thought they could lawyer their way out of security protocols. People try to use fake tickets all the time, usually in your demographic. The words hit the air like a physical force. Maria looked up from her computer screen with wide eyes. James's phone camera caught Derek's exact phrasing, and he watched his live viewer count jump from 1-200 to 3-400 in a matter of seconds. Sarah Kim stopped pretending to check her emails and focused entirely on the confrontation. My demographic, Marcus repeated slowly. Could you please clarify what you mean by that? Derek realized he'd crossed a line, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. You know what I mean. Pattern recognition. It's part of my job. Pattern recognition, Marcus said. Based on what pattern? Experience. Experience with what Derek was getting frustrated. The passenger was supposed to be intimidated, not asking clarifying questions. Look, I've been doing this job for 14 years. I know when something doesn't feel right, and what doesn't feel right about me having a first-class ticket. The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Derek knew he couldn't say what he was really thinking. He couldn't say that in his experience, black men in hoodies didn't fly first class to London. He couldn't say that something about the casual clothes and expensive seat combination triggered his instincts. He couldn't say that he'd learned to trust his gut over paperwork, and his gut was telling him this didn't add up. Instead, he said, I just need to verify a few more things. Marcus nodded. He'd been in this position before, standing at the intersection of suspicion and authority, forced to prove his right to exist in spaces where his presence was questioned. But this time felt different. This time he could feel the weight of witnesses, the power of documentation, the potential for something bigger than just one man's prejudice. Take your time, Marcus said quietly. I'll wait. Behind them, Flight 2847's first officer appeared at the gate podium, checking his watch. The plane was supposed to push back in 7 minutes, but the boarding process had completely stalled. Passengers in the jet bridge were getting restless, and the crew was starting to calculate delay costs and connection impacts. Derek opened his tablet again, this time pulling up a different screen. I'm going to need to see your credit card, he announced. The one you used to purchase this ticket. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Why to verify the purchase? You have my ID. You have my boarding pass. You can verify the purchase through Delta's computers. I need to see the card. Marcus reached back into his wallet and pulled out a black American Express Centurion card. The card was made of titanium and had no preset spending limit. It was invitation only, available to fewer than 100,000 people worldwide. Annual fees started at $5,000. Derek stared at the card like it was a foreign object. He'd seen plenty of credit cards in his 14 years of airport security, but he'd never seen one quite like this. The weight felt wrong in his hands, too heavy for plastic, and the lack of visible numbers or text made it look almost fake. What kind of card is this? He asked. American Express Centurion. Never seen one of these before. They're not common. Derek turned the card over in his hands, looking for some sign that it was counterfeit. How much is the spending limit? There isn't one. Derek's expression shifted. No spending limit meant either unlimited wealth or unlimited fraud. And looking at the man standing in front of him wearing clothes that probably cost less than $200, total unlimited wealth seemed less likely. Anyone can get a fake card made, Derek said, handing the card back to Marcus. Probably stolen. The accusation dropped like a bomb. James's live stream viewer count jumped past 800-900 people, and he could see comments flooding in faster than he could read them. Sarah Kim stepped slightly closer, her phone camera now openly recording. Maria's hands froze over her keyboard. Marcus looked at Derek for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even quieter than before, but somehow carried more weight. Officer Hoffman, he said, reading Derek's name tag. I understand you're doing your job, but I want to make sure I understand what you're suggesting. Are you saying you believe my identification is fake? My boarding pass is fraudulent and my credit card is stolen? Derek realized that Marcus had boxed him into a corner. If he said yes, he was making serious accusations that would require paperwork, investigations, and evidence. If he said no, he had no grounds to continue the detention. but backing down now in front of all these witnesses would make him look weak and incompetent. "I'm saying I have reasonable suspicion to investigate further," Derek replied. Reasonable suspicion based on what specific evidence? Derek's face flushed red. He wasn't used to passengers who understood legal terminology or who pushed back against his authority. Usually, a firm voice and a badge were enough to make people comply even when they had done nothing wrong. "Based on inconsistencies in your story." "What inconsistencies?" "I told you my name, my employer when I bought the ticket, and how I bought it. I showed you my ID, boarding pass, and credit card. What part of that is inconsistent?" Derek was trapped and he knew it. But 14 years of unchecked authority don't disappear overnight. Instead of admitting his mistake, he escalated. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me for enhanced screening." Enhanced screening meant a private room, a full-body search, and potentially hours of detention while they ran background checks and verified information. It was Derek's nuclear option, the thing he pulled out when passengers refused to cooperate or when he wanted to teach someone a lesson about questioning his authority. Marcus looked at Derek, then at Bradley, then at the growing crowd of passengers and gate agents watching the confrontation. He could feel his phone buzzing in his pocket, probably his assistant wondering why his flight was delayed. He could see the confusion and concern in Maria's eyes, the phone cameras documenting every word, the mix of sympathy and suspicion from the other passengers. He had two choices. He could escalate demand to speak to managers, threaten legal action, and turn this into a public spectacle. Or he could stay calm, let the situation play out, and trust that the truth would eventually surface. Marcus Rodriguez Johnson had built his fortune on reading people and understanding power dynamics. He knew that Derek was operating from a position of assumed authority, but that authority was about to be tested in ways Derek couldn't imagine. "Enhanced screening," Marcus repeated. "For what specific security threat? I'll determine that during the screening process." Marcus nodded slowly, then pulled out his phone. "I need to make a phone call first." Derek's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. "No phone calls during a security investigation. This is to inform my business associates that I'll be delayed. No phone calls." Marcus looked at his phone screen, then back at Derek. For the first time since the confrontation began, he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or an angry smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested Derek had just made a very, very big mistake. "Officer Hoffman," Marcus said quietly, "you just denied me the right to a phone call. You've accused me of fraud, theft, and providing false information. You've detained me without probable cause, and are threatening enhanced screening based on what you've admitted is pattern recognition rather than evidence." Derek's confidence wavered slightly. The passenger was talking like a lawyer, now using terms that sounded official and threatening. "I'm following proper security protocols," Derek said. "Are you?" Marcus asked. "Because I'm pretty sure proper protocols don't include profiling passengers based on race or assuming their financial status based on their clothing." The word profiling hit the crowd like electricity. James's live stream exploded past 15,000 viewers, and Sarah Kim's hands shook slightly as she continued recording. Maria finally stood up from her chair, her conscience overriding her job security. "Derek," Maria called out softly. "Maybe we should stay out of this," Derek snapped. "This is a security matter." But it was too late. The situation had crossed from a simple travel delay into something much bigger. Passengers were pulling out phones, gate agents were whispering to each other, and somewhere in the administrative offices of Miami International Airport, someone was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. Marcus looked at his phone one more time, then at Derek. "Officer Hoffman," he said in exactly 8 minutes, "you're going to wish you'd let me make that phone call." Derek Hoffman's jaw tightened at Marcus's words, interpreting the quiet prediction as a threat rather than a warning. 14 years of unchallenged authority had taught him that passengers who pushed back were usually hiding something, and passengers who made cryptic statements about timing were definitely worth investigating further. "Is that a threat?" Derek asked, stepping closer to Marcus. "It's a fact," Marcus replied calmly. But since you've denied me the right to make a phone call, I guess we'll both have to find out what happens next. Let me tell you what happens next, Derek said, pulling out a pair of latex gloves from his belt. Enhanced screening, full search, background verification. And if anything comes back suspicious, we'll be having a very different conversation. James Rivera watched the confrontation escalate through his phone screen, his live viewer count climbing past 18,000 people. The comments were flooding in so fast he couldn't read them all, but he caught fragments. This is profiling Sue them. Record everything I've been there. Stay strong, brother. Y'all, James whispered to his camera. This is exactly what we talk about. Black man, first-class ticket, and suddenly there's a security issue. 18,000 of you watching this happen in real time. Sarah Kim had stopped pretending to mind her own business. Her finger hovered over the Twitter app as she recorded with her other hand, ready to amplify this moment across every social platform she could access. As a Korean-American woman who'd faced her share of assumptions and microaggressions, she recognized the familiar pattern of authority figures manufacturing justifications for bias. "This is wrong," she said loud enough for Derek to hear. Derek turned toward her with irritation. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "Discrimination concerns everyone," Sarah shot back. "And that's exactly what this is." Robert Taylor, the insurance executive, shook his head at Sarah's comment. "The man is just doing his job," he said from his position in line. "Security is important. If this passenger can't handle a few questions, maybe he shouldn't be flying." "A few questions?" Sarah asked, turning to face Robert. "He's shown his ID, boarding pass, and credit card. What else is there to question except the color of his skin?" "That's not what this is about," Robert replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then what is it about?" Sarah challenged. Robert looked at Marcus, taking in the casual clothes and backpack, then at the first-class boarding pass. Something did seem off, he had to admit. But as he watched Derek pull on the latex gloves with theatrical precision, he began to wonder if Sarah might be right. Bradley Morrison hovered nearby, checking his watch every few seconds. Flight 22847 was now 7 minutes past its scheduled boarding time, and he could see passengers in the jet bridge starting to return to the gate area. Delays meant paperwork explanations to corporate potential domino effects on connecting flights. But intervening in a security matter meant stepping into territory that could end his career. Derek Bradley said quietly, "Maybe we could move this somewhere more private. We've got a full flight here." Derek ignored him, focused entirely on Marcus. "I need you to empty all your pockets and place everything on this table," he said, gesturing to a small security table that had been wheeled over from the TSA checkpoint. Marcus looked at the table, then at the growing crowd, then back at Derek. "You want me to empty my pockets in front of 50 passengers? You should have thought about privacy before you started making threats." "I didn't make threats. I made observations. Empty your pockets, sir." Marcus sighed and began removing items from his pockets. His phone, a slim wallet, car keys, a small tube of lip balm, 2 pens, and a pack of gum. Nothing suspicious, nothing threatening, nothing that suggested fraud or criminal activity. Derek examined each item with exaggerated care, as if the lip balm might contain state secrets or the pens might be explosive devices. When he picked up Marcus's phone, he turned it over in his hands like it was evidence. "This is an expensive phone," Derek observed. "It's an iPhone," Marcus replied. "Latest model." "Yes. How does a consultant afford a $1,200 phone?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. James's live stream comments exploded with outrage. Sarah Kim shook her head in disgust. Even Robert Taylor shifted uncomfortably at the obvious bias in the question. "The same way anyone else affords a $1,200 phone," Marcus said. "They buy it." Derek wasn't satisfied. "What kind of consulting do you do exactly? Airport logistics and operations management." "What does that mean?" Marcus paused, considering how much to reveal. "We help airports optimize their operations. Passenger flow, cargo handling, security protocols, facility management. Security protocols. Derek's interest sharpened. What kind of security protocols? The kind that ensure passengers are treated fairly and efficiently while maintaining safety standards. Derek's face darkened. He was starting to get the feeling that this passenger was mocking him somehow, using fancy words to make him look stupid in front of the crowd. "I've never heard of your company," Derek said. "That doesn't surprise me," Marcus replied. The comment wasn't meant as an insult, but Derek took it as one. His authority was being questioned, his knowledge was being dismissed, and his professional competence was being undermined in front of a growing audience. It was time to reassert control. "I'm going to need to search your bag," Derek announced. Marcus gestured to his backpack. "Go ahead." Derek unzipped the main compartment and began removing items. A laptop computer, a tablet, a folder of documents, a phone charger, a small toiletry bag. All normal travel items, nothing suspicious or concerning. But when Derek opened the laptop and saw the screen saver, his expression changed. The Meridian Global Consulting logo filled the screen along with text that read, "Property of Marcus Rodriguez Johnson, Senior Partner." "Anyone can make a fake screensaver," Derek muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Look at the documents Marcus suggested." Derek opened the folder and found himself staring at contracts, presentations, and correspondence that made his head spin. Airport authority agreements, government consulting contracts, technical specifications for security equipment, financial projections involving hundreds of millions of dollars. One document in particular caught his attention, a consulting proposal for Miami International Airport outlining $800 million in renovation and upgrade projects. Marcus's signature appeared at the bottom as the lead consultant. Derek stared at the document, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be right. The man standing in front of him wearing jeans and sneakers couldn't possibly be involved in $800 million airport projects. But the documents looked real, the signatures looked authentic, and the level of detail suggested insider knowledge that couldn't be easily faked. "These are probably stolen," Derek said, but even he didn't sound convinced. From whom, Marcus asked. Derek didn't have an answer for that. Maria Gonzalez watched the interaction with growing horror. She'd seen Derek's random selections before, but never anything this blatant or this public. The passenger had done nothing wrong, shown all the required documentation, and even submitted to searching that went well beyond normal protocols. But Derek seemed determined to find something, anything that would justify his initial suspicion. Derek, Maria said again, more firmly this time. "I think we should, Maria." "I told you to stay out of this," Derek snapped, "unless you want to explain to management why you're interfering with a security investigation." The threat was clear and Maria fell silent. But her silence felt different now, not compliant but calculating. She pulled out her own phone and began typing rapidly. Derek turned his attention back to Marcus's belongings, examining business cards that identified Marcus as a senior partner at Meridian Global Consulting. The cards were high-quality, professionally printed, and featured contact information, including a direct phone number and corporate email address. "Anyone can print business cards," Derek said, echoing his earlier statement about fake tickets and stolen credit cards. "Call the number Marcus suggested." "What? Call the number on the business card. Verify that I work there." Derek looked at the card, then at Marcus, then at the growing crowd of passengers and airline staff watching the confrontation. Calling to verify employment was a reasonable step, but it would also mean admitting that he'd detained a passenger for 15 minutes without taking the most basic verification step available. "I don't have time for phone calls," Derek said. "You have time to search through my personal belongings and question my right to fly first class. But you don't have time to make a 30-second phone call that would confirm everything I've told you." Derek's face flushed red. The passenger was making him look incompetent in front of dozens of witnesses, and the worst part was that the passenger was right. A simple phone call would resolve everything, but making that call would also reveal that Derek had been operating on assumption and bias rather than proper procedure. James Rivera couldn't stay silent any longer. "Sir," he called out to Derek, "I'm live streaming this to over 20,000 people right now. You might want to make that phone call." Derek whirled around to face James. "Turn off that camera." "No, sir. I'm in a public area documenting what appears to be discriminatory treatment. This is a security matter. No recording allowed. Show me the law that says I can't record in a public area of an airport," James challenged. Derek couldn't because no such law existed. Passengers had the right to record in public areas of airports, and Derek knew it. But James's live stream meant that this confrontation was being broadcast to thousands of people in real time, creating a permanent record that could be used against him later. "How many people are watching?" Sarah Kim asked James. 22,000 and climbing," James replied. "Comments are going crazy. People sharing their own stories of being profiled at airports. This is blowing up." Derek's radio crackled to life. "Derek, this is Control. We're getting calls about a situation at Gate B47. Status report." Derek grabbed his radio, turning away from the crowd. "Minor security verification in progress. Situation under control. Reports suggest passenger recording and social media activity. Supervisor en route." Derek's stomach dropped. A supervisor meant questions paperwork and accountability for his actions. If this turned into a discrimination complaint, his 14-year career could be in jeopardy. "Copy that," Derek replied into his radio. Marcus had been listening to the radio exchange with interest. "Supervisor en route," he repeated. "Good. Maybe they'll be more interested in following proper procedures." "I am following proper procedures," Derek insisted. "Are you? Because I'm pretty sure proper procedures don't include refusing verification phone calls, conducting public searches without probable cause, and denying passengers their right to record in public areas." Derek was trapped, and he knew it. Every move he made was being documented, broadcast, and scrutinized by thousands of people. But backing down now would mean admitting that he'd been wrong from the beginning, and Derek Hoffman had never been good at admitting mistakes. Instead, he doubled down. "Sir, based on suspicious documentation, inconsistent behavior, and failure to provide satisfactory verification of identity and travel purpose, I'm placing you under airport security detention pending further investigation." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. James's live stream comments erupted with outrage. Sarah Kim gasped audibly. Even Robert Taylor, who had been inclined to support security, looked uncomfortable with the escalation. But it was Maria Gonzalez who finally found her voice. "Derek, stop!" she said, standing up from behind the gate counter. "Just stop!" Derek turned toward her with fury in his eyes. "Maria, I warned you." "No," Maria interrupted, her voice stronger now. "You warned me, but I'm done being quiet. I've watched you do this 17 times in the past 6 months. 17 passengers pulled aside for random screening, and 15 of them looked exactly like this gentleman. That's not random, Derek. That's profiling." The crowd went silent. Even James's live stream comments seemed to pause as viewers absorbed Maria's words. 17 times. 15 minorities. The pattern was undeniable. Derek's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Maria replied. "I keep records, Derek. Every passenger interaction, every delay, every complaint. And your pattern is crystal clear." She turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. "Mr. Rodriguez Johnson," she said, "I'm pulling up your reservation right now. Full verification through Delta's corporate systems." Derek lunged toward Maria's computer. "You don't have authorization." "I have authorization to verify passenger reservations," Maria said firmly. "It's literally my job." She turned the computer screen so the crowd could see it. "Marcus Rodriguez Johnson, First Class Seat 2A. Purchased through Meridian Global Consulting corporate account. Payment verified. No flags or alerts in the system. Ticket is legitimate, Maria announced. Purchased 3 days ago through corporate travel account. Payment processed successfully. Passenger has premier status with Delta and has flown this route 16 times in the past 2 years with no issues. Derek stared at the screen, his last justification crumbling. The passenger's story had checked out completely. The ticket was real, the payment was legitimate, and the travel history showed a pattern of regular business travel between Miami and London. That doesn't change anything, Derek said weakly. I still have reasonable suspicion, based on what Maria demanded. Based on his clothes, based on his race, based on your assumption that black men can't afford first-class tickets. The question hung in the air like an accusation. James's live stream had grown to over 25,000 viewers, and Sarah Kim had started her own recording on Instagram Live. The hashtag GateB47 was beginning to trend on Twitter, with hundreds of people sharing similar stories of airport discrimination. Derek's radio crackled again. Derek Supervisor Martinez is on her way. ETA 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Derek had 2 minutes to decide whether to continue this confrontation or find a way to back down gracefully. But grace had never been Derek's strong suit, and the presence of cameras and live streams meant that any retreat would be documented and shared with thousands of people. So instead of backing down, Derek made the decision that would end his career. I don't care what the computer says, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. I don't care about corporate accounts or travel history. I know a fake when I see one, and this whole thing smells fake. He turned to Marcus with 14 years of unchecked authority behind his voice. You're coming with me for enhanced screening, and if you resist, you'll be arrested for interfering with a federal security investigation. Marcus looked at Derek for a long moment, then at Maria, then at the dozens of passengers and airline staff watching the confrontation. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear him, but his words carried a weight that made everyone lean forward. Officer Hoffman Marcus said you just made the biggest mistake of your professional life. And in exactly 90 seconds, you're going to understand exactly what kind of mistake that was. He looked at his watch, then back at Derek. 89 seconds, Marcus said calmly. 88. 87. Derek's hand moved to his handcuffs, but before he could speak, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed through the terminal. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving fast, coming from the direction of the airport's administrative offices. 83 seconds, Marcus said, still counting down. 82. 81. James's live stream viewer count hit 28,000 people, and Sarah Kim's Instagram Live was climbing toward 15,000. The hashtag GateB47 was spreading across social platforms, with people sharing videos, photos, and their own stories of airport discrimination. 78 seconds, Marcus said. 77. Derek could hear the footsteps getting closer, but he couldn't see who was approaching. All he knew was that a passenger was counting down to something cameras were recording everything, and he'd just committed himself to a course of action that was about to be very difficult to explain. 73 seconds, Marcus said. 72. The footsteps were almost at gate B47 now, and Derek could hear voices. Multiple people talking rapidly in Spanish and English, using terms like immediate response and code orange and full documentation. 68 seconds, Marcus said. 67. Derek's radio erupted with chatter. Multiple supervisors were asking for status updates, someone was requesting legal support, and he could hear his own name being repeated with increasing urgency. 63 seconds, Marcus said. And then Derek Hoffman saw something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Coming around the corner toward gate B47 was a group of people who looked like they meant business. Serious business. airport security supervisors, Delta management personnel, and someone in a crisp business suit who carried herself with the kind of authority that made seasoned airport workers step aside without being asked. 58 seconds. Marcus continued his countdown, watching Derek's face go from red to pale to something approaching gray. The group was led by a Hispanic woman in her late 40s wearing a navy blue blazer with an airport administration badge that read Director of Operations. Behind her walked two men in suits, a woman with a tablet who was typing rapidly and three airport security supervisors who looked like they were responding to a major incident. 53 seconds, Marcus said. 52. Derek's hand was still on his handcuffs, but his grip had loosened considerably. Something about the urgency of the approaching group and the passengers' confident countdown was making him reconsider his position. But 14 years of habit and pride kept him from backing down completely. "I don't care who's coming," Derek said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This is still a security matter." 47 seconds, Marcus replied. 46. James Rivera was narrating the scene to his live stream audience, which had now grown to over 30,000 viewers. "Y'all, something big is happening here. Airport management is rushing toward us. This brother is counting down like he knows exactly what's about to happen. And security officer Derek is starting to look real nervous." Sarah Kim had abandoned her Instagram Live to start recording on multiple platforms simultaneously. The hashtag GateB47 was trending nationally on Twitter, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of airport discrimination and demanding accountability for Derek's actions. 41 seconds, Marcus said. 40. The approaching group was close enough now that Derek could see their faces clearly. The woman leading them was Adriana Velasco, and Derek recognized her from airport-wide meetings and training sessions. She was the Director of Operations for Miami International Airport, which meant she outranked everyone at Gate B47 by several levels of management. 36 seconds, Marcus said. Behind Adriana walked Carlos Martinez, Derek's own supervisor, along with two men Derek had never seen before, but who carried themselves like federal agents or corporate investigators. The woman with the tablet was still typing furiously, and Derek could see her holding a phone to her ear while she worked. 31 seconds, Marcus said. 30. Derek's radio exploded with chatter. "All units code orange at Gate B47. Repeat code orange. Full documentation protocol in effect. All interactions to be recorded and preserved. Code orange." Derek had heard about Code Orange in training, but he'd never seen it implemented. It was reserved for incidents involving high-value passengers, potential discrimination complaints, or situations that could result in significant legal liability for the airport. Someone had escalated this far beyond a simple security screening. 25 seconds, Marcus said. 24. Derek looked around, desperately trying to understand how a routine passenger screening had turned into a Code Orange incident with airport directors and federal investigators rushing to the scene. The passenger had made one phone call request which Derek had denied, but somehow word had reached the highest levels of airport management. 20 seconds, Marcus said. 19. Adriana Velasco reached Gate B47 and immediately took in the scene, Derek standing over Marcus, with handcuffs ready. Maria behind the counter looking relieved. Dozens of passengers recording with their phones, and James live streaming to over 32,000 viewers while providing real-time commentary. 15 seconds, Marcus said. 14. Adriana's eyes locked onto Derek, then shifted to Marcus, then back to Derek. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that ended careers and launched investigations. Officer Hoffman Adriana said, her slight accent giving weight to each word step away from the passenger immediately. "Ma'am, this is a security matter," Derek protested. "I have reasonable suspicion." 10 seconds. Marcus interrupted quietly. 9, 8, Officer Hoffman. Adriana said again, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I said step away from the passenger. Now. Derek looked at his supervisor, Carlos hoping for support, but Carlos was staring at Marcus with an expression that mixed recognition with horror. As the lead security supervisor for Concourse B, Carlos had attended meetings where Meridian Global Consulting presentations were discussed. He'd seen Marcus's name on contract documents and facility upgrade proposals. He knew exactly who Derek had been detaining for the past 20 minutes. 5 seconds, Marcus said. 4, 3, 2. Derek stepped back from Marcus, his hand finally releasing the handcuffs. 1, Marcus said, then looked at his watch and smiled. Right on time. Adriana approached Marcus directly, her entire demeanor shifting from authoritative to apologetic. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, she said, extending her hand. I am Adriana Velasco, Director of Operations for Miami International Airport. I cannot express how sorry I am for this incident. The revelation hit the crowd like a lightning strike. Derek's face went completely white. James's live stream comments exploded with reactions. Sarah Kim audibly gasped. Even Robert Taylor, who had been skeptical of discrimination claims, began to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson. Derek repeated weakly, suddenly recognizing the name from briefings and airport management meetings he'd attended over the years. Yes, Adriana confirmed, still speaking to Marcus. Senior partner at Meridian Global Consulting. Lead consultant on our $800 million terminal renovation project. The man whose signature appears on security protocol recommendations that we implement airport-wide. She turned to Derek with fury in her eyes. The man you just detained, searched, and threatened to arrest for the crime of flying first class while black. Derek's legs felt weak. Marcus Rodriguez Johnson wasn't just any passenger. He was one of the most important business partners Miami International Airport had. His company designed security protocols, managed facility upgrades, and consulted on operational efficiency for airports across 4 continents. His recommendations influenced how millions of passengers were treated every day, and Derek had spent 20 minutes treating him like a criminal. I didn't know, Derek stammered. You didn't know because you never asked the right questions, Adriana replied sharply. You made assumptions based on appearance. You ignored proper verification procedures, and you escalated a routine passenger interaction into a potential federal discrimination case. Carlos stepped forward, his face grim. Derek, you're relieved of duty immediately. Turn in your badge, radio, and any other airport equipment. Security will escort you out. Wait, Derek protested. I was following protocol. You were following bias, interrupted a new voice. Everyone turned to see Miguel Santos, a 23-year-old junior security officer who had been watching the incident from a distance. Miguel was Hispanic, had been working airport security for only 8 months, and generally tried to stay out of conflicts with senior officers like Derek. But as he watched Derek's treatment of Marcus, something inside him had broken. He'd seen too many passengers treated differently based on skin color or clothing. He'd heard too many random selections that weren't random at all. He'd kept quiet for 8 months, afraid of losing his job. But watching Derek abuse his authority while cameras recorded everything had pushed Miguel past his breaking point. Miguel, stay out of this, Derek warned. No, Miguel said, stepping forward. I'm done staying out of it. He turned to Adriana and Carlos. Ma'am, Sir Officer Hoffman has been selecting passengers for additional screening based on racial profiling for months. We've all seen it, but nobody wants to report it because he's senior staff. The admission hit the crowd like a physical force. James's live stream viewer count jumped past 35,000, and Sarah Kim immediately started a new Instagram post with Miguel's confession as the caption. What do you mean you've all seen it? Adriana demanded. Miguel swallowed hard, knowing his next words would change everything. We're trained to watch for inconsistencies, right? Expensive tickets with casual appearance, designer clothes that don't match credit card types, passengers who seem nervous or out of place. Those are legitimate security indicators, Carlos said. But that's not how it gets applied, Miguel replied. Officer Hoffman and some others, they use it to target minorities. If a young black guy has a first-class ticket, that's inconsistent. If a Hispanic woman is wearing expensive jewelry but casual clothes, that's suspicious. If someone speaks with an accent but has a high-value credit card, that's worth investigating. Derek's face was now completely gray. Miguel was exposing years of unwritten policies and informal practices that Derek had assumed would never be questioned. That's not how I was trained, Derek protested weakly. Maybe not officially, Miguel said, but it's what happens in practice. You told me last month that experience teaches you to trust your instincts about people. You said that paperwork can be faked, but behavior patterns don't lie. Miguel turned to Marcus. Sir, I'm sorry we put you through this. You didn't deserve it. Nobody deserves it. Adriana's expression had shifted from angry to horrified as she began to understand the scope of the problem. This wasn't just one officer making one mistake. This was a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been normalized and passed down through informal training. Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson, she said, would you be willing to discuss this incident in detail with our investigation team? Marcus looked at Derek, who was now slumped against a nearby chair, his 14-year career collapsing around him. Then he looked at Miguel, who had risked his job to tell the truth. Finally, he looked at the dozens of passengers who had witnessed the entire confrontation and the thousands more watching through live streams. I'll do more than discuss it, Marcus said quietly. I'll help you fix it. He pulled out his phone and showed Adriana a screen that made her eyes widen. It was an app interface labeled Meridian Bias Detection System with real-time data streaming across multiple categories: interaction duration, passenger demographics, screening frequency, and outcome patterns. We've been tracking airport security interactions for 6 months, Marcus explained. AI-powered analysis of passenger treatment patterns across 12 major airports. Miami International was flagged as having significant bias indicators, particularly in Concourse B. Adriana stared at the data. The patterns were undeniable. Officer Derek Hoffman had conducted additional screenings on 47 passengers in the past 6 months. 43 of them were minorities. Average screening time for white passengers, 3.2 minutes. Average screening time for black passengers, 12.7 minutes. Average screening time for Hispanic passengers, 9.4 minutes. This data, Adriana said slowly. How long have you been collecting it? 6 months of passive monitoring, Marcus replied. We don't interfere with airport operations. We just document interaction patterns and identify statistical anomalies that suggest bias. Derek finally understood what had happened. He hadn't just randomly selected a passenger for additional screening. He had selected the one passenger in the airport who was actively monitoring and documenting discriminatory treatment patterns. He had walked directly into a trap that had been 6 months in the making. James Rivera was narrating the revelation to his live stream audience in real time. Y'all, this is incredible. This brother wasn't just a random passenger. He's been tracking airport discrimination with AI technology. He caught them in their own bias pattern. This is next-level justice right here. The hashtag bias detection system started trending alongside Gate B47, with tech industry professionals and civil rights advocates sharing the story across their networks. Within minutes, major news outlets were picking up the story, and airport security discrimination was becoming a national conversation. Sarah Kim looked at her phone and gasped. This story is on CNN's homepage, she announced. BBC International just tweeted about it. This is going worldwide. Carlos looked at Derek with a mixture of disappointment and fury. 14 years, Derek. 14 years of service, and this is how it ends. I was doing my job, Derek said weakly. No, Carlos replied. You were doing your bias. There's a difference. Adriana turned to the crowd of passengers and airline staff who had gathered around gate B47. Ladies and gentlemen, Miami International Airport sincerely apologizes for this incident. Officer Hoffman's behavior does not represent our values or our commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. She looked directly at the phone cameras. To everyone watching this live stream, please know that we take discrimination seriously and we will be implementing immediate changes to ensure this never happens again. Marcus stepped forward. Ms. Velasco, I appreciate the apology, but apologies don't change behavior patterns. What changes behavior is accountability training and monitoring. Are you willing to implement those changes? Adriana nodded immediately. Absolutely. What do you recommend? Marcus smiled for the first time since the incident began. Let's start with real-time bias detection technology in all screening areas. Cameras with AI analysis that can identify discrimination patterns as they happen, not 6 months later. You can do that. We can have the system installed and operational within 2 weeks. Derek listened to the conversation with growing horror. Not only was his career over, but his discriminatory behavior was about to become the catalyst for airport-wide policy changes that would prevent future officers from repeating his mistakes. Officer Hoffman, Adriana said, turning back to Derek, "You are terminated immediately. Your airport access is revoked, and this incident will be reported to the Department of Homeland Security for potential federal civil rights violations." Derek's badge and radio felt heavy in his hands as he removed them. 14 years of authority gone in 20 minutes, all because he couldn't see past his own assumptions about who belonged in first class. Ma'am Miguel spoke up again. There are other officers who use the same methods. This isn't just Officer Hoffman. Adriana's expression hardened. Then we'll find them all. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson. How quickly can your bias detection system identify other problematic patterns? Marcus pulled up another screen on his phone. We already have. Would you like the report now, or would you prefer to review it privately first? Now, Adriana said firmly. Everyone should hear this. Marcus projected his phone screen onto a nearby gate display monitor. The data was devastating. 7 security officers across 3 concourses showed significant bias patterns. Hundreds of passengers had been subjected to discriminatory treatment over the past 6 months. The pattern was undeniable, widespread, and had been happening under the noses of management who thought they were running a fair and equitable operation. James's live stream viewer count hit 42,000 people as the data appeared on screen. Comments poured in from passengers sharing their own experiences at Miami International and other airports. Airport bias data started trending with people demanding similar transparency at airports across the country. This changes everything, Adriana said quietly, studying the data. Not just here, but everywhere. Marcus nodded. That's the point. Discrimination thrives in darkness. When you turn on the lights and show people the patterns, it becomes impossible to ignore or excuse. He looked at Derek, who was still standing nearby with security officers waiting to escort him out. Officer Hoffman Marcus said quietly, I want you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about destroying your life. This is about making sure no other passenger has to stand where I stood today being questioned about their right to exist in a space they paid to occupy. Derek nodded miserably, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. In exactly 4 minutes, Marcus continued, You're going to walk out of this airport for the last time. And when you do, I want you to remember that your behavior today didn't just hurt me. It hurt every person who looks like me who will fly through here in the future. But because you got caught, because it was documented, because people saw the truth, those future passengers will be treated better than I was today. Derek looked up at Marcus, saw the cameras still recording, saw the thousands of people watching online, saw his career ending in the most public way possible. I'm sorry, Derek said, his voice barely audible. I'm truly sorry. Marcus studied Derek's face for a moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you are, and I hope that means you'll do better in whatever comes next. The security officers approached Derek and gestured toward the exit. As he walked away from Gate B47 for the last time, his shoulders slumped with the weight of understanding exactly what he had lost and why. Behind him, Marcus was already discussing implementation timelines with Adriana. Miguel was being promoted to bias prevention coordinator, and Maria was being praised for speaking up when it mattered most. Flight 22847 to London was finally ready to board nearly an hour behind schedule. But the delay had captured something more valuable than on-time performance. It had captured proof that discrimination could be detected, documented, and defeated when people chose courage over comfort. As Marcus walked toward the jet bridge, James Rivera ended his live stream with words that would be quoted in news articles for weeks to come. Y'all just watched history. Not just one man standing up to bias, but technology and truth working together to change the whole system. This is how we win. Not with anger, but with evidence. Not with violence, but with video. Not with silence, but with solutions. The hashtag solutions not silence started trending immediately. As Derek Hoffman was escorted away from Gate B47, his 14-year career in ruins, the true scope of what had just occurred began to ripple through Miami International Airport like shockwaves from an earthquake. The live streams had captured everything, the social media posts were spreading exponentially, and news outlets were already dispatching reporters to cover what was rapidly becoming a national story about airport discrimination and technological accountability. But for Marcus Rodriguez Johnson, the man at the center of the storm, the most important part was just beginning. Adriana Velasco walked alongside Marcus as they moved toward the jet bridge, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd witnessed. As director of operations for one of the busiest airports in the world, she'd dealt with discrimination complaints before, but nothing like this. Never with this level of documentation, never with real-time AI monitoring, and never with a victim who turned out to be one of their most important business partners. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson. Adriana said as they walked, I need to ask you directly. How long has Meridian been monitoring our operations without our knowledge? Marcus paused near the gate podium, noting that James Rivera was still recording with his phone, though his live stream had officially ended. The question deserved a complete answer, and Marcus had learned long ago that transparency, even when uncomfortable, was the foundation of trust. 6 months of passive monitoring, Marcus replied. But not just Miami International. 12 major airports across the country, all with similar bias detection protocols. Adriana stopped walking. 12 airports. 12 airports tracking over 200,000 security interactions, identifying patterns of discriminatory treatment that airport management wasn't aware of or wasn't addressing effectively. Carlos Martinez, Derek's former supervisor, had been following the conversation with growing unease. Are you saying you've been spying on airport security operations without authorization? Marcus turned to Carlos with a slight smile. I'm saying we've been documenting public interactions in public spaces using publicly available technology. Everything we recorded could have been observed by any passenger with a phone camera and a calculator. But the AI analysis, the pattern recognition, the real-time monitoring Carlos pressed, that goes beyond casual observation. It does, Marcus agreed. And that's precisely why it's effective at identifying discrimination that casual observation might miss. Sarah Kim, who had been listening to the conversation while uploading her recordings to multiple social media platforms, looked up from her phone with confusion. Wait, you're saying you've been tracking discrimination at 12 airports. How is that legal? Marcus pulled out his phone and opened an app that displayed legal documentation. Meridian Global Consulting maintains public safety research contracts with the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration, and the Federal Aviation Administration. Our mandate includes monitoring passenger treatment patterns to identify security vulnerabilities and operational inefficiencies. Adriana's eyes widened as she recognized the federal authorization logos on Marcus's phone screen. You're conducting federal oversight of airport operations. Among other things, yes. And Miami International just failed a federal oversight test. Spectacularly, Marcus confirmed. The implications hit Adriana like a freight train. Federal oversight meant federal reporting requirements. Federal reporting meant potential federal sanctions. Potential federal sanctions meant congressional hearings, media scrutiny, and possible federal intervention in airport management. How bad is it? Adriana asked quietly. Marcus showed her his phone screen again, this time displaying a comprehensive report that made her face go pale. Miami International Airport ranked 4th worst among major U.S. airports for racial bias in security screening. The patterns were so pronounced that they suggested institutional failure rather than individual bad actors. 4th worst, out of how many, Adriana asked. 57 major airports. Adriana closed her eyes and took a deep breath. What happens now? That depends on how you want to handle it, Marcus replied. We can issue a standard federal oversight report that goes through normal bureaucratic channels and gets buried in committee reviews for 18 months. Or we can implement immediate corrective measures that turn Miami International into a model for bias-free airport security. What's the difference? Marcus gestured to James Rivera, who was still documenting the conversation, and to Sarah Kim, whose social media posts had already been shared thousands of times. The difference is that this incident has already gone viral. The world is watching. You can either be the airport that got caught discriminating and tried to cover it up, or you can be the airport that got caught discriminating and led the industry in fixing the problem. Maria Gonzalez, who had been watching the conversation from behind the gate counter, stepped forward with her computer tablet. Ms. Velasco, if I may, I think Mr. Rodriguez Johnson is offering us something unprecedented. What do you mean? Adriana asked. I've been keeping informal records of passenger interactions for 2 years, Maria explained. I've seen patterns, but I've never had the tools or authority to address them. What he's describing could prevent every incident like this from happening again. Miguel Santos, the junior security officer who had exposed Derek's discriminatory practices, joined the group. Ma'am, if we could see bias patterns in real time, if we could get alerts when interactions go on too long or when certain officers are disproportionately targeting minorities, it would change everything. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's exactly what the system does. It monitors interaction duration, passenger demographics, screening frequencies, and outcome patterns. When an officer starts showing bias indicators, the system flags it immediately. And then what Carlos asked, immediate supervisor notification, mandatory retraining peer review, and if the patterns continue, permanent removal from passenger-facing duties. Adriana was beginning to understand the scope of what Marcus was offering. You're talking about real-time accountability for every security interaction. I'm talking about making bias impossible to hide and expensive to maintain, Marcus replied. When discrimination becomes visible and measurable, it becomes unacceptable. James Rivera, who had been listening to the technical discussion, raised his hand like a student in class. Excuse me, but I think y'all are missing something important here. Everyone turned to look at him. Sir James said to Marcus, You just got racially profiled, detained, searched, and threatened with arrest on camera in front of 45,000 people. You proved that airport security has institutional bias problems, and now you're offering to help them fix it instead of suing them into bankruptcy. Why? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus looked at James, then at the assembled airport staff, then at Sarah Kim, who was recording his answer for social media. Because suing them into bankruptcy doesn't fix the problem for the next passenger who looks like me. Marcus said simply, Revenge is personal. Justice is universal. I want universal justice. Sarah Kim lowered her phone, clearly moved by the response. That's actually beautiful. It's also practical, Marcus added. Meridian Global Consulting makes money by solving problems, not by creating them. Fixing airport bias is a multi-million-dollar business opportunity. Helping Miami International become a model for bias-free operations gives us a proof of concept we can sell to every other airport in the world. Adriana's respect for Marcus deepened as she understood his strategy. He wasn't just a victim seeking vindication. He was a businessman who had turned his own discrimination experience into a market opportunity for positive change. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson. Adriana said what would implementation look like. Marcus opened another app on his phone, this one showing detailed implementation timelines and cost projections. 2 weeks for basic bias detection cameras in all security screening areas. 4 weeks for full AI integration with real-time alerts. 6 weeks for comprehensive training programs and accountability protocols. Cost $2.3 million for full implementation, but that's partially offset by federal grants for bias prevention technology and fully offset by avoiding the legal liability costs of continued discriminatory practices. Carlos whistled softly. You've really thought this through. We've been planning this for 6 months, Marcus replied. The only question was which airport would be first. And Derek just volunteered Miami International, Adriana said with dark humor. Derek made it impossible for you to say no, Marcus corrected. When bias becomes visible, denial becomes impossible. Miguel stepped forward again. Sir, what about the officers who were already using discriminatory practices? The data you showed identified 7 people across 3 concourses. Marcus looked at Miguel with approval. That's an excellent question, and it demonstrates exactly why you should be promoted to Bias Prevention Coordinator. Miguel looked shocked. You, Marcus, confirmed. You had the courage to speak up when it mattered. You understood the difference between following orders and doing what's right. Those are exactly the qualities needed for bias prevention work. Adriana nodded immediately. Miguel, effective, immediately. You're promoted to Bias Prevention Coordinator with a 30% salary increase and direct reporting to my office. Miguel's eyes filled with tears. Ma'am, Thank you. I won't let you down. You've already proven you won't, Marcus said. Speaking truth to power is never easy, but it's always necessary. Carlos looked uncomfortable as he processed the implications for his other security officers. What about the other 7 officers the data identified? Immediate suspension pending investigation, Adriana said firmly. Full review of their interaction patterns, passenger complaints, and compliance with bias prevention training. And if the investigation confirms discriminatory patterns, Carlos asked. Termination, Adriana replied without hesitation. We cannot and will not tolerate discrimination in any form. Marcus held up his phone again. The investigation is already complete. The data is comprehensive and conclusive. All 7 officers show clear patterns of racial bias in their screening practices. Carlos's face fell as he realized that 7 of his security officers were about to lose their jobs. Is there any possibility of retraining or second chances? There are 43 passengers who were discriminated against over the past 6 months, Marcus replied. Did any of them get second chances when they were profiled, detained, and humiliated? Why should their attackers get more consideration than their victims received? The question silenced Carlos completely. He knew Marcus was right, but it was still difficult to accept that his department was about to lose 8 security officers in a single day. Sarah Kim had been recording the entire conversation, and she looked up from her phone with amazement. This is incredible. You're not just fixing one incident, you're changing the entire system. That's the goal Marcus confirmed. Individual accountability creates universal change. James Rivera nodded enthusiastically. Man, this is like watching justice happen in real time. Not just punishment for the bad actors, but actual solutions for the future. He turned to his phone camera, which he'd been using for informal recording since his official live stream ended. Y'all, I'm going to be honest with you. I came to Miami today thinking I was just traveling for business, but I ended up witnessing something historic. This brother didn't just stand up to discrimination. He dismantled it. Adriana looked at her watch and realized that Flight 22847 to London had been delayed for over an hour. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson. I know you have a flight to catch. How would you like to proceed? Marcus smiled. I'd like to board my flight, sit in seat 2A, and fly to London. But first, I'd like to make sure this conversation continues after I leave. What do you mean? Marcus handed Adriana a business card with contact information for 3 Meridian Global Consulting team members. Implementation team. They'll be here tomorrow morning to begin installing the bias detection system. The federal oversight report will be filed on Friday, and congressional hearings on airport discrimination are scheduled for next month. Adriana stared at the business card. Congressional hearings. This incident was documented, broadcast live, and viewed by over 45,000 people. Senator Martinez's office called me 20 minutes ago asking if I'd be willing to testify about airport discrimination patterns. And will you? Absolutely. But I'd prefer to testify about solutions rather than just problems. If Miami International implements bias-free security protocols, I can use you as a positive example rather than a cautionary tale. The offer was clear: cooperate with immediate reform, or become a case study in congressional hearings about institutional discrimination. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, Adriana said, extending her hand. You have a deal? Miami International Airport will be the first fully bias-free major airport in the United States. Marcus shook her hand. I look forward to working with you. He turned to Maria, who had been instrumental in documenting Derek's discriminatory practices. Ms. Gonzalez, would you be interested in joining the implementation team? We could use someone with your observational skills and institutional knowledge. Maria's face lit up. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to make sure no other passenger goes through what you witnessed today. Yes, Maria said immediately. Absolutely yes. Marcus turned to Miguel. Mr. Santos, your first assignment as bias prevention coordinator is to review every security interaction from the past week and identify any patterns that need immediate attention. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Finally, Marcus turned to Carlos, whose expression remained troubled. Supervisor Martinez, I know this is difficult, but discrimination is like cancer. You can't cure it by ignoring it or treating only the symptoms. You have to remove it completely. Carlos nodded reluctantly. I understand. It's just 8 officers in one day. 8 officers who were discriminating against passengers in one day, Marcus corrected. The question isn't why we're removing them. The question is why they weren't removed sooner. Carlos had no answer for that. Adriana checked her watch again. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, your flight is boarding final call. Marcus looked toward the jet bridge, where a small group of passengers were still waiting to board. The captain himself had come out to apologize for the delay and to ensure that Marcus felt comfortable continuing his travel. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain announced to the remaining passengers on behalf of Delta Airlines and Miami International Airport, I want to personally apologize for the incident you witnessed today. This is not who we are, and it's not who we will be moving forward. He approached Marcus directly. Sir, I want you to know that what happened today was unacceptable, and I want you to know that it will never happen again on any flight I command. Marcus shook the captain's hand. Thank you, Captain. I appreciate that. As Marcus walked toward the jet bridge, Sarah Kim called out to him. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, what do you want people to remember about what happened here today? Marcus paused and considered the question. Behind him, James Rivera was recording. Maria was smiling, Miguel was standing taller than he had all day, and Adriana was already on the phone with her implementation team. "I want them to remember that dignity isn't determined by your clothes or your color," Marcus said. "I want them to remember that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and I want them to remember that technology can be used to create accountability, where accountability didn't exist before." He paused, then added, "But mostly, I want them to remember that when good people stand up and speak out, change is possible." Sarah Kim posted that quote to her social media accounts before Marcus had even reached his seat. Within minutes, it was being shared across every platform, translated into dozens of languages, and quoted by news outlets around the world. As Marcus finally settled into seat 2A on Flight 2847, he pulled out his phone and sent a text message to his assistant. "Incident resolved. Miami International implementing full bias detection protocols. Use as model for Phase 2 rollout." The response came back immediately. "Congressional hearing confirmed for next month. Senator Martinez wants to discuss national implementation." Marcus smiled as he put his phone away. When he'd walked into Miami International Airport 3 hours earlier, he'd been just another business traveler trying to get home. When he walked out of London Heathrow tomorrow morning, he'd be the man who had changed airport security forever. Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate at 9:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours behind schedule. But as Marcus looked out the window at the lights of Miami disappearing below, he reflected that some delays were worth it. Behind him, in the Miami International Airport administrative offices, Adriana Velasco was already working with Meridian's implementation team to install bias detection cameras. Miguel Santos was reviewing security interaction data with new eyes and newfound authority. Maria Gonzalez was designing passenger advocacy protocols that would prevent future discrimination incidents. And Derek Hoffman was driving home through the Miami darkness unemployed for the first time in 14 years, trying to understand how 20 minutes of bias had destroyed a career he'd built over a decade and a half. The ripple effects were just beginning. 3 days after the Gate B-47 incident, Miami International Airport looked the same from the outside. The same planes landed and departed, the same crowds of travelers moved through the terminals, and the same announcements echoed across the concourses. But underneath the familiar surface, everything was changing. In conference room A12 of the airport's administrative building, Adriana Velasco sat across from a team of federal investigators who had arrived to review the discrimination patterns that Marcus Rodriguez Johnson's AI system had documented. The data spread across the conference table told a story that none of them wanted to acknowledge, but all of them had to confront. Ms. Velasco said, "Agent Patricia Williams from the Department of Homeland Security in my 15 years of investigating civil rights violations. I've never seen data this comprehensive or this damning." Agent Williams was a black woman in her 40s who had built her career investigating institutional discrimination in federal agencies. She'd seen police departments that profiled minorities' immigration facilities that treated asylum seekers differently based on nationality, and courthouse security that subjected certain groups to enhanced scrutiny. But the Miami International data revealed bias patterns that were both more sophisticated and more pervasive than anything in her experience. The statistical analysis shows clear evidence of institutional discrimination, continued Agent Carlos Mendoza from the Transportation Security Administration. But what's unprecedented is the technological documentation. Usually, discrimination cases rely on victim testimony, witness statements, and incomplete records. This data provides minute-by-minute documentation of biased interactions over 6 months. Adriana studied the federal investigators' faces, trying to gauge whether Miami International was facing criminal charges, civil sanctions, or federal intervention. "What are the potential consequences for the airport?" Agent Williams opened a thick folder filled with legal precedents and regulatory guidelines. "Normally, we'd be looking at federal civil rights lawsuits, congressional hearings, court-ordered oversight, and potential loss of federal transportation funding. The legal liability alone could reach hundreds of millions of dollars. Normally, Adriana caught the qualifier in Agent Williams's statement, but this case is unusual because the victim is also proposing the solution Agent Mendoza explained. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson's company has presented a comprehensive reform plan that addresses not just the immediate discrimination issues, but the underlying system failures that allowed bias to flourish unchecked. Agent Williams pulled out her tablet and showed Adriana a presentation that Marcus's team had sent to federal agencies the day after the incident. The Meridian Bias Detection System represents a quantum leap forward in civil rights protection, real-time monitoring, immediate intervention, and comprehensive accountability measures. And it's already working, Agent Mendoza added. Since implementation began 3 days ago, security interaction patterns have normalized across all demographic groups. No more disproportionate screening times, no more selective additional searches, no more random selections that weren't random. Adriana felt a mixture of relief and amazement. You're saying the system has eliminated bias in 3 days? We're saying the system has made bias visible and immediately addressable. Agent Williams corrected. When security officers know their interactions are being monitored and measured, discriminatory behavior becomes professionally suicidal. She showed Adriana real-time data from the past 72 hours. Security screening times were now consistent across racial groups. Additional screening requests had dropped by 89% overall and 100% for minority passengers. Complaint frequencies had fallen to 0. But the most significant finding, Agent Mendoza continued, is what the expanded data analysis revealed about other airports. He pulled up a national map showing bias patterns across the 57 major airports in Meridian's monitoring network. Miami International had been bad, but it wasn't the worst. 3 airports showed even more pronounced discrimination patterns, and 12 others showed significant bias indicators. We're looking at a national problem, not just a local one, Agent Williams said. Institutional bias in airport security that affects millions of passengers annually. Adriana stared at the national data, understanding that the Gate B47 incident had exposed the tip of a much larger iceberg. What happens now? That depends on how Miami International performs as the pilot program for bias-free airport security, Agent Mendoza replied. If the Meridian system successfully eliminates discrimination here, it becomes the model for national implementation. And if it doesn't work? Agent Williams' expression grew serious. Then we proceed with traditional enforcement methods, federal lawsuits, congressional oversight, and court-ordered reforms that take years to implement and cost exponentially more than voluntary cooperation. The message was clear. Miami International could be a leader in airport security reform, or it could be an example of what happened to airports that resisted change. But it couldn't return to the status quo of unmonitored discrimination. Meanwhile, in the newly established Bias Prevention Office on Concourse B, Miguel Santos was discovering exactly how deep the discrimination problems had been. His first week as Bias Prevention Coordinator had been a crash course in institutional failure, informal discrimination policies, and the way bias could become normalized through unchecked repetition. Miguel said Dr. Jennifer Park, a civil rights consultant brought in by Meridian to review security practices. What you've uncovered here is a textbook case of institutional discrimination becoming embedded through informal training and peer pressure. Dr. Park was a Korean-American professor of sociology who specialized in workplace discrimination patterns. She'd been studying implicit bias in high-pressure environments for over a decade, but the Miami International security data provided unprecedented insight into how discrimination functioned in real time. The former officers weren't necessarily conscious racists, Dr. Park explained, but they were operating in an environment where biased assumptions were rewarded, where intuition was prioritized over evidence, and where questioning discriminatory practices was discouraged. Miguel nodded as he reviewed interview transcripts from the 7 terminated security officers. They all say the same thing. They thought they were doing their jobs correctly, They believed their experience taught them to identify suspicious passengers. But when you analyze their definition of suspicious, Dr. Park continued, it correlates almost perfectly with race, ethnicity, and economic assumptions. Young black men with expensive electronics were suspicious. Hispanic women with designer clothing were suspicious. Middle Eastern passengers with one-way tickets were suspicious. She pulled up data showing the terminated officers' screening patterns over the past 2 years. The bias was so pronounced it looked intentional, but the interview transcript suggested it was unconscious. "This is what institutional discrimination looks like," Dr. Park said. "Not conscious hatred, but unconscious assumptions that get reinforced through workplace culture and informal training." Miguel studied the data, trying to understand how 8 experienced security officers could all develop similar biases without explicit coordination. "How do you prevent this from happening again?" "That's exactly what the Meridian system does," Dr. Park replied. "It makes unconscious bias visible and immediately correctable. When an officer starts showing discriminatory patterns, the system flags it before it becomes embedded behavior." She showed Miguel real-time monitoring data from the past 3 days. Every security interaction was tracked, analyzed, and compared against baseline patterns. Officers who showed even minor bias indicators received immediate feedback and additional training. "It's like having a civil rights supervisor watching every interaction," Miguel observed. "It's better than that," Dr. Park corrected. "Human supervisors can miss subtle bias or might have biases themselves. AI monitoring is consistent, objective, and comprehensive." As Miguel reviewed the implementation progress, he realized that the Meridian system was doing more than just preventing discrimination. It was also improving overall security effectiveness by eliminating the time wasted on biased selections and focusing attention on genuine security concerns. Dr. Park Miguel said the data shows that security effectiveness has actually improved since we stopped profiling based on race and ethnicity. "That's not surprising," Dr. Park replied. "Bias makes security less effective because it focuses attention on the wrong indicators. When officers stop looking for suspicious demographics and start looking for actual behavioral indicators, they catch real threats more effectively." She pulled up comparative data showing that weapon detection, contraband seizures, and legitimate security alerts had all increased since bias detection implementation began. Discrimination doesn't just violate civil rights. It compromises security by creating false priorities and blind spots. Back in conference room A12, the federal investigation was reaching its conclusions. Agent Williams and Agent Mendoza had spent 3 days reviewing every aspect of Miami International's security operations, interviewing passengers and staff, and analyzing the comprehensive data that Marcus's system had collected. Ms. Velasco, Agent Williams said, "Our investigation concludes that Miami International Airport had engaged in institutional discrimination against minority passengers for an extended period. The patterns are clear. The evidence is overwhelming, and the civil rights violations are substantial." Adriana braced herself for the consequences. However, Agent Mendoza continued the airport's immediate cooperation with remedial measures, comprehensive implementation of bias detection technology, and commitment to serving as a model for national reform significantly mitigates the enforcement response. Agent Williams opened her final report folder. Instead of federal sanctions and court oversight, Miami International will be designated as the pilot program for the National Airport Bias Prevention Initiative. "What does that mean?" Adriana asked. "It means Miami International becomes the proof of concept for bias-free airport security," Agent Williams explained. "Federal funding for continued system development, technical support for implementation challenges, and showcase status for airports considering similar reforms." Agent Mendoza added, "It also means congressional testimony next month about successful discrimination prevention, rather than congressional hearings about civil rights violations." Adriana felt a wave of relief mixed with responsibility. Miami International had avoided federal sanctions, but now carried the burden of proving that airport bias could be eliminated through technology and accountability. "There's one more thing," Agent Williams said, "Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson has requested a meeting with you tomorrow morning. He has additional proposals for expanding the bias prevention program. What kind of proposals? Passenger advocacy systems, employee bias training programs, and community engagement initiatives? Agent Mendoza replied. He's thinking beyond just security screening to comprehensive civil rights protection throughout airport operations. That evening, Maria Gonzalez sat in her new office in the Passenger Advocacy Department, a position that hadn't existed a week earlier but was now central to Miami International's reformed operations. Her job was to ensure that passengers who experienced any form of discrimination had immediate recourse and support. Maria said James Rivera, who had become an unofficial consultant to the Bias Prevention Program after his live-stream documentation of the Gate B-47 incident. I keep thinking about how many passengers went through what Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson went through, but without cameras recording or AI monitoring or anyone speaking up for them. Maria nodded as she reviewed passenger complaint records from the past 2 years. The files revealed dozens of discrimination incidents that had been dismissed, minimized, or simply ignored by previous management. That's exactly why this program is so important, Maria replied. Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their race, ethnicity, religion, or appearance. And now we have the tools and authority to ensure that happens. She showed James the new passenger advocacy hotline that had been established, allowing travelers to report discrimination in real time through phone calls, text messages, or a dedicated mobile app. When someone reports bias, Maria explained the incident is immediately escalated to my office, reviewed through the AI monitoring system, and addressed with the involved personnel within hours rather than weeks or months. James looked at the complaint resolution timelines with amazement. You're talking about same-day response to discrimination complaints. We're talking about real-time response, Maria corrected. If a passenger reports bias during an ongoing interaction, airport management can intervene immediately to prevent the situation from escalating. She pulled up the new passenger advocacy dashboard, which showed every discrimination report response time and resolution outcome. Since implementation began, the system had received 12 bias reports, all of which had been resolved within 4 hours. More importantly, Maria continued the reports help us identify officers who might be developing biased patterns before they become serious problems. Early intervention prevents future Derek Hoffmans. James nodded approvingly. So you're not just responding to discrimination, you're preventing it. Exactly. Prevention is always better than punishment. As the week came to an end, Derek Hoffman sat in his empty apartment in Kendall, staring at a laptop screen showing news coverage of the airport bias prevention program that had emerged from his termination. Every article mentioned his name as the catalyst for reform, but not in the way he'd ever wanted to be remembered. The unemployment check would help with rent for a few months, but his prospects for future security work were non-existent. No airport government facility or private security company would hire someone whose discriminatory practices had been documented, broadcast live, and analyzed by federal investigators. Derek had spent 14 years building a career that had collapsed in 20 minutes of bias and poor judgment. But as he watched the news coverage of positive changes at Miami International, he began to understand something he hadn't grasped during his years of unchecked authority. The passengers he had profiled, searched, and humiliated weren't abstract security threats or statistical patterns. They were people with families, jobs, dreams, and the same right to dignity and respect that Derek expected for himself. Derek opened his laptop and began typing an email to Miguel Santos, the young officer whose courage had exposed the discrimination culture Derek had helped create. It was time to take responsibility for more than just his own actions. It was time to help ensure that future security officers understood what Derek had learned too late, that bias doesn't enhance security, it compromises it. And that treating people with dignity isn't just good civil rights policy, it's good security practice. The email was the first step in a journey toward redemption that would take Derek years to complete. But it was a start. Meanwhile, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Marcus Rodriguez Johnson was reviewing implementation reports from Miami International while flying to his next consulting assignment in Amsterdam. The bias detection system was performing even better than projected discrimination incidents had dropped to zero, and federal investigators were recommending national implementation. But Marcus knew that technology was only part of the solution. Real change required changing hearts and minds, not just policies and procedures. The upcoming congressional testimony would be an opportunity to advocate for comprehensive reform that addressed the root causes of bias, not just its symptoms. Marcus opened his laptop and began drafting testimony that would call for bias detection systems at every major airport in America. Federal funding for comprehensive civil rights training and passenger advocacy programs that ensured discrimination could never again flourish in darkness and silence. The future of airport security wouldn't just be safer, it would be fairer. And that difference would matter to millions of travelers who deserved to move through the world without fear of being judged by their appearance rather than their actions. Change. Marcus reflected as he looked out at the clouds below was possible when good people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The key was making injustice visible, measurable, and immediately addressable. Technology could do that. But it took human courage to make technology serve justice. And at Gate B47 in Miami International Airport, that courage had changed everything. 2 weeks after the Gate B47 incident, Miguel Santos walked through Miami International Airport with a confidence he'd never possessed during his 8 months as a junior security officer. As the newly appointed Bias Prevention Coordinator, he carried authority to address discrimination in real time, access to comprehensive monitoring data, and the respect of airport management who recognized his courage in exposing institutional problems. But his most important task today wasn't reviewing data or training officers. It was meeting with Derek Hoffman, the terminated security supervisor whose discriminatory actions had sparked airport-wide reform. Derek sat in the small conference room in the airport's administrative building wearing civilian clothes that made him look smaller and older than he had in uniform. 14 years of security authority had been stripped away, leaving behind a middle-aged man struggling to understand how bias had destroyed his career and reputation. Derek Miguel said as he entered the room, "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Derek looked up with hollow eyes. "Miguel, I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies. For the discrimination for trying to silence you when you spoke up and for creating a workplace culture that made speaking up feel dangerous." Miguel sat across from Derek, noting how different the man looked without his badge and radio. "I appreciate that, Derek. But I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because you can help prevent other officers from making the same mistakes you made." Derek's expression shifted from resignation to confusion. "What do you mean?" "The Bias Prevention Program needs someone who understands how discrimination develops in security culture," Miguel explained. "Someone who can identify the warning signs, the informal training practices, and the peer pressure that normalizes biased behavior." Derek stared at Miguel, not comprehending. "You want my help. I want your insight. Not to excuse what you did, but to understand how it happened so we can prevent it from happening again." Miguel pulled out a tablet showing data from the bias detection system. "Since implementation began, we've identified 3 officers showing early bias indicators. Not full discrimination patterns yet, but warning signs that could develop into serious problems." He showed Derek the interaction data for the 3 officers. Slightly longer screening times for minority passengers, marginally higher rates of additional searches for certain demographic groups, and informal questioning patterns that suggested unconscious bias. "These officers aren't malicious," Miguel continued. "They're developing the same unconscious patterns that you developed over years of unchecked authority. The question is, how do we intervene before bias becomes embedded behavior?" Derek studied the data, recognizing patterns that mirrored his own discriminatory development. You want me to help train officers about unconscious bias. I want you to help identify when officers are starting to develop problematic patterns, Miguel corrected. You spent 14 years in airport security. You understand how bias can feel like good instincts and how discrimination can masquerade as effective security. Derek was quiet for a long moment, processing Miguel's proposal. You're offering me a chance to help fix the problem I helped create. I'm offering you a chance to take responsibility for more than just your own actions, Miguel replied. You can help ensure that future officers understand what you learned too late, that bias compromises security and violates civil rights. Derek looked at the bias detection data again, seeing his own patterns reflected in the warning signs Miguel had identified. What would this involve? Consulting on bias recognition training. Helping develop intervention protocols for officers showing early warning signs, sharing your experience with the federal investigators who are designing national bias prevention programs. Miguel leaned forward. Derek, your discrimination was documented, broadcast, and analyzed by federal agencies. Your story is going to be told whether you participate or not. The question is, do you want to be remembered only as the officer who got caught discriminating or as the officer who helped prevent future discrimination? The offer hung in the air between them. Derek understood that Miguel was providing something rare in accountability situations, a path toward redemption that involved taking responsibility rather than avoiding consequences. If I do this, Derek said slowly, will it undo the harm I caused? Nothing can undo the harm you caused, Miguel replied honestly. The passengers you profiled, searched, and humiliated won't forget those experiences, but you can help ensure that fewer passengers experience what you put them through. Derek nodded slowly. What's the first step? Miguel opened a folder containing interview transcripts from the 7 other terminated security officers. Help me understand how 8 different officers all developed similar bias patterns without explicit coordination. What in the security culture taught you to see certain passengers as automatically suspicious? Derek took the folder and began reading, seeing his own justifications and assumptions reflected in his former colleagues' statements. It wasn't formal training, he said after a few minutes. It was informal guidance from senior officers, unofficial wisdom about what to watch for, and peer pressure to demonstrate thoroughness. Explain. Derek set down the folder. When I started in security 14 years ago, experienced officers would give new recruits unofficial advice. Trust your gut. Look for inconsistencies. People who don't fit the profile are worth watching. What profile? That was the problem. The profile was never explicitly defined, so it became whatever unconscious assumptions individual officers brought to the job. Young black men with expensive electronics, Hispanic women with designer clothing but economy tickets, Middle Eastern passengers with one-way bookings. Miguel took notes as Derek spoke, understanding how discriminatory assumptions had been passed down through informal mentorship. So bias became embedded in security culture through unwritten rules and unofficial guidance. Exactly. And because the bias was never explicitly stated, it was difficult to identify or address. Officers thought they were using experience and intuition, not realizing they were profiling based on race and ethnicity. Derek continued reviewing the interview transcripts, identifying specific phrases and assumptions that revealed discriminatory thinking patterns. Look at this, he said, pointing to a statement from one of the terminated officers. Passenger appeared nervous and out of place in first class. That's code for black passenger in expensive seat. Miguel highlighted the phrase on his tablet. How do we train officers to recognize when experience is actually bias? That's where your bias detection system is revolutionary, Derek replied. It makes patterns visible that were previously invisible. When officers can see objective data about their screening practices, they can't hide behind claims of intuition or experience. He showed Miguel another section of the transcripts. This officer says he was following his training to watch for behavioral inconsistencies. But when you analyze his screening data, the only inconsistency he consistently noticed was black passengers in premium cabin seats. So the bias detection system doesn't just catch discrimination, Miguel observed. It reveals self-deception. Right. Officers who think they're being professional and thorough can see objective evidence that they're actually being biased and discriminatory. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. Adriana Velasco entered, accompanied by Dr. Sa, Jennifer Park, and Marcus Rodriguez Johnson, who was back from London to review the bias prevention program's progress. Miguel, Adriana said, "I hope we're not interrupting important work." "Actually," Miguel replied, "Derek has been providing valuable insights into how unconscious bias develops in security culture." Marcus looked at Derek with interest. "Mr. Hoffman, I appreciate your willingness to participate in bias prevention efforts." Derek struggled to meet Marcus's eyes. "Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, I need to apologize directly. What I did to you was wrong, harmful, and inexcusable. I violated your civil rights and your human dignity based on my own unconscious assumptions and biases." Marcus studied Derek's face, seeing genuine remorse rather than self-serving contrition. "I appreciate the apology, Derek. But more importantly, I appreciate your willingness to help prevent other passengers from experiencing what you put me through." "That's what I'm trying to do," Derek replied. "Help Miguel identify how bias develops so it can be prevented rather than just punished." Dr. Park opened her research folder. "Derek, your insights about informal training and peer pressure align with our academic research on institutional discrimination, but you're providing practical details that help explain how bias becomes normalized in workplace cultures." She showed Derek social psychology research about implicit bias in high-pressure environments. "Your experience confirms that discrimination often results from unconscious assumptions rather than conscious hatred, but it also shows how those assumptions can become embedded through institutional practices." Derek reviewed Dr. Park's research, recognizing his own cognitive patterns in the academic descriptions. "This research describes exactly how I developed discriminatory practices without realizing I was discriminating, which is why your participation in bias prevention training could be so valuable," Marcus said. "Officers who understand how bias develops unconsciously are better equipped to recognize and prevent it in themselves and their colleagues." Adriana looked at her watch. "Derek, we have a proposal for you. The federal investigators want to interview someone who can explain how security bias develops from the inside. They're designing national training programs and need input from officers who understand the problem firsthand." Derek considered the proposal. "Would this involve testifying before Congress?" "Possibly," Adriana replied. "But it would definitely involve helping develop training programs that could prevent thousands of future discrimination incidents." Derek was quiet for a moment, understanding the full scope of what was being offered. "This isn't just about Miami International, is it? This is about changing airport security culture nationwide." "That's exactly what it's about," Marcus confirmed. "Your discriminatory actions were documented and broadcast, creating national awareness of airport bias problems. Now your insights about how bias develops could help solve those problems throughout the country." Miguel added, "Derek, you have a choice. You can disappear from this story and be remembered only as the officer who got caught discriminating. Or you can take responsibility for helping fix the culture that created the problem." Derek looked around the room at the people who were offering him a path toward redemption through service rather than hiding. What specifically would be required? Dr. Park opened her laptop. "Participation in federal bias prevention research. Input on training program development. Possible testimony about how discriminatory practices develop and how they can be prevented. And ongoing consultation with airport bias prevention programs," Miguel added. "Your experience with discriminatory thinking could help identify officers who are developing problematic patterns before they become serious problems." Derek understood that accepting the proposal would mean public accountability for his actions and permanent association with airport discrimination. But it would also mean channeling his mistakes into preventive action that could protect future passengers. "I'll do it," Derek said quietly. "If my mistakes can help prevent other officers from making the same mistakes, then something positive can come from this situation." Marcus extended his hand to Derek. "Thank you. Taking responsibility for past mistakes and working to prevent future ones is exactly the kind of accountability that creates real change." Derek shook Marcus's hand, feeling both the weight of his past actions and the possibility of meaningful redemption. "Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, I want you to know that this isn't about me trying to rehabilitate my image. This is about me trying to prevent other passengers from experiencing what I put you through." "I understand," Marcus replied, "and I respect your commitment to being part of the solution rather than just acknowledging the problem." As the meeting concluded, Adriana reviewed the implementation timeline for Derek's participation in bias prevention efforts. "Derek, your first consultation session is next week with the Federal Training Development Team. They want to understand how informal mentorship creates discriminatory practices." Derek nodded. "I'll be ready." Miguel gathered his materials, satisfied that Derek's insights would strengthen bias prevention efforts significantly. "Derek, thank you for being willing to take responsibility for more than just your own actions. This could help officers across the country recognize bias before it becomes discrimination." "It's the least I can do," Derek replied. "Actually, it's the most I can do to try to make amends for the harm I caused." As Derek left the conference room, he passed through the same airport where he'd spent 14 years of his career. But now he saw it differently. Instead of seeing potential threats and suspicious passengers, he saw people deserving dignity and respect regardless of their appearance or assumed economic status. The bias detection cameras were visible throughout the security screening areas, monitoring every interaction and ensuring that discrimination could never again flourish in darkness. Officers wore small badges identifying them as bias prevention participants, acknowledging their commitment to fair treatment for all passengers. Derek's former colleagues avoided eye contact as he walked past, uncertain how to relate to someone whose discriminatory practices had triggered airport-wide reform. But Derek wasn't there to reconnect with old relationships. He was there to help build new systems that would prevent future officers from repeating his mistakes. At the security checkpoint where he'd detained Marcus Rodriguez Johnson 2 weeks earlier, a diverse group of passengers moved smoothly through screening without incident. Interaction times were consistent across racial groups. Additional searches were genuinely random, and officers treated every passenger with professional courtesy. Derek paused at the spot where his career had ended, understanding finally what Marcus had meant about justice being universal rather than personal. The changes at Miami International weren't about punishing Derek Hoffman. They were about protecting every future passenger who deserved to travel without fear of discrimination. As Derek walked out of Miami International Airport for what he hoped would not be the last time, he carried with him a new understanding of his role in creating positive change. His discriminatory actions had exposed airport bias problems that needed fixing. Now his insights about how bias developed could help fix those problems permanently. It wasn't redemption exactly. The harm he'd caused couldn't be undone, but it was responsibility, and responsibility channeled toward prevention was the closest thing to justice that situations like this could provide. Behind him, the airport continued its transformation into a model of bias-free security. Ahead of him lay an opportunity to help ensure that transformation succeeded not just at Miami International, but at airports across the nation. Derek Hoffman's career in airport security had ended in disgrace, but his work in bias prevention was just beginning. 6 months later, Marcus Rodriguez Johnson stood before the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation and Safety in a packed congressional hearing room preparing to deliver testimony that would reshape airport security policy nationwide. Behind him sat dozens of passengers who had experienced discrimination, airport workers who had spoken up against bias, and federal investigators who had documented institutional failures across the aviation industry. Senator Martinez Marcus said, addressing the subcommittee chair 6 months ago, "I was detained, searched, and threatened with arrest at Miami International Airport for the crime of flying first class while black. Today, I'm here to report that airport discrimination can be eliminated through technology accountability and the courage to confront bias wherever it exists." The hearing room was silent as Marcus continued. The Meridian Bias Detection System has been operational at 12 major airports for 6 months. In that time, discrimination incidents have decreased by 94%. Passenger complaints related to profiling have dropped to near zero, and security effectiveness has actually improved as officers focus on legitimate threats rather than racial assumptions. Senator Martinez leaned forward. "Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson, you've stated that bias detection technology can eliminate discrimination. But technology is only as good as the people implementing it. How do you ensure that human bias doesn't simply adapt to technological monitoring?" "That's an excellent question," Senator Marcus replied. "Technology identifies bias patterns, but changing behavior requires human accountability and institutional commitment. That's why the Bias Prevention Program includes comprehensive training, immediate intervention protocols, and ongoing community engagement." He gestured to Miguel Santos, who sat in the witness section wearing his Miami International Airport Bias Prevention Coordinator badge. Miguel Santos risked his job to expose discriminatory practices when it would have been easier to stay silent. That kind of moral courage is what makes technological monitoring effective. Senator Rodriguez, a Hispanic woman from Texas, addressed her next question to Miguel. "Mr. Santos, what have you learned about preventing bias in high-pressure workplace environments?" Miguel stood and approached the witness microphone. "Senator, I learned that silence in the face of discrimination is complicity. When good people stay quiet, bad behavior becomes normalized. But when institutions create safe channels for reporting bias and swift accountability for addressing it, workplace culture changes rapidly. Can you provide specific examples? Since implementing bias detection at Miami International, we've identified and corrected discriminatory patterns in early stages. Officers who show statistical bias indicators receive immediate retraining and peer support. Officers who resist correction are removed from passenger-facing duties. The key is intervention before bias becomes embedded behavior." Senator Williams, a black woman from Georgia, asked Mr. Santos, "You've worked with Derek Hoffman, the officer whose discrimination triggered these reforms. What has that collaboration taught you about accountability and redemption?" Miguel paused, choosing his words carefully. "Senator Derek Hoffman's discriminatory actions caused real harm to real passengers. That harm can't be undone, but his willingness to take responsibility and help prevent future discrimination has helped us understand how bias develops and how it can be prevented." "Is that sufficient accountability for civil rights violations?" "Accountability has multiple dimensions," Miguel replied. "Derek lost his career, his reputation, and his financial security. But more importantly, his actions exposed institutional problems that affected thousands of passengers. The question isn't whether Derek has been punished enough, but whether his mistakes have led to meaningful change that protects future passengers." Senator Martinez turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson, what do you want Americans to understand about airport discrimination and bias prevention?" Marcus stood and walked closer to the microphone, his voice carrying the weight of both personal experience and professional expertise. "Senator, I want Americans to understand that bias isn't inevitable. Discrimination isn't a necessary security trade-off. And treating all passengers with dignity isn't just good civil rights policy, it's good security practice." He paused, looking directly at the cameras broadcasting the hearing live. But most importantly, I want Americans to understand that change is possible when good people refuse to accept injustice as normal. The passengers at Gate B47 who recorded Derek Hoffman's discrimination, the officers like Miguel who spoke up against biased practices, and the airport management who implemented immediate reforms, they proved that accountability and justice are achievable when people choose courage over comfort. Senator Martinez asked the final question. What is your recommendation for national policy regarding airport security bias prevention? Marcus pulled out his phone and projected data onto the hearing room's main screen. Senator, I recommend immediate implementation of bias detection technology at all 430 commercial airports in the United States, federal funding for comprehensive anti-bias training programs, and mandatory passenger advocacy systems that ensure discrimination complaints receive swift investigation and resolution. The data showed projected outcomes: discrimination incidents reduced by 90% or more. Security effectiveness improved through elimination of false targeting, and passenger confidence in fair treatment restored across all demographic groups. The technology exists, Marcus continued. The training protocols have been proven effective. The accountability systems are operational and successful. What's required is the political will to implement nationwide what has already succeeded at the pilot airports. And the cost $2.3 billion for full national implementation over 3 years, Marcus replied. But the cost of not implementing is far higher. Continued discrimination costs the aviation industry billions in legal liability, lost passenger confidence, and reduced security effectiveness. More importantly, it costs our nation its commitment to equal treatment under law. As the hearing concluded, Senator Martinez announced that the subcommittee would recommend full federal funding for national bias prevention implementation. The pilot programs had proven successful beyond all projections, and the testimony had demonstrated both the necessity and feasibility of eliminating airport discrimination. In the hearing room, audience Derek Hoffman sat quietly listening to discussions about bias prevention programs he was helping develop. His participation in federal training initiatives had been crucial to understanding how discrimination developed in security culture, but he remained largely invisible in public discussions of the reforms. After the hearing, Derek approached Marcus in the Capitol hallway. Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, I wanted to thank you for including me in the bias prevention work. I know it would have been easier to exclude the officer who discriminated against you. Marcus looked at Derek, seeing a man who had genuinely grappled with his own biases and committed to preventing others from repeating his mistakes. Derek, excluding you would have meant missing crucial insights about how bias develops. Including you means more officers will recognize discriminatory patterns before they cause harm. I hope so, Derek replied. I hope my mistakes lead to fewer passengers experiencing what I put you through. They already have Marcus confirmed. The bias prevention protocols you've helped develop are protecting thousands of passengers who will never know how close they came to experiencing discrimination. As Derek walked away, Marcus reflected on the complex nature of accountability and redemption. Derek's discrimination had been real and harmful, but his participation in prevention efforts was helping protect future passengers from similar experiences. Justice wasn't simple, but it could be meaningful when it prevented future harm, rather than just punishing past actions. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same Miami International Airport where his discrimination experience had begun. But now, he was there for a celebration, the official dedication of the National Airport Bias Prevention Center, headquartered at MIA, and serving as the training hub for bias detection implementation nationwide. The dedication ceremony drew civil rights leaders, aviation industry executives, federal transportation officials, and dozens of passengers whose discrimination experiences had led to the comprehensive reforms. Maria Gonzalez had been promoted to National Passenger Advocacy Director. Miguel Santos was now Senior Bias Prevention Coordinator for the entire Southeast region. Even Derek Hoffman was there quietly working as a bias recognition training consultant. Ladies and gentlemen, Adriana Velasco announced to the assembled crowd 1 year ago, Miami International Airport was the site of documented discrimination that violated a passenger's civil rights and compromised our security mission. Today, we are proud to serve as the national model for bias-free airport operations. She gestured to data displays showing comprehensive bias prevention metrics from airports across the country. In the 12 months since national implementation began, airport discrimination incidents have decreased by 91%. Passenger satisfaction with security treatment has increased across all demographic groups, and security effectiveness has improved as officers focus on legitimate threats rather than racial profiling. Marcus took the podium for the final speech of the ceremony. 12 months ago, I was told I didn't belong in first class because of the color of my skin. Today, every passenger in America can travel with confidence that they will be treated with dignity regardless of their race, ethnicity, religion, or appearance. He paused, looking out at the audience filled with people whose courage had made comprehensive change possible. But this victory belongs to everyone who refused to accept discrimination as normal. The passengers who recorded bias when they saw it. The employees who spoke up against discriminatory practices. The investigators who documented institutional failures. The managers who implemented immediate reforms. And yes, even the officers who took responsibility for their mistakes and helped develop prevention protocols. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he concluded. Justice isn't about perfect people making perfect decisions. Justice is about imperfect people choosing to do better to be better and to build better systems that protect everyone's dignity. That's what we've accomplished here, and that's what we'll continue accomplishing everywhere. Bias tries to take root. The applause was sustained and emotional, reflecting not just celebration of progress achieved, but commitment to vigilance required for lasting change. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Marcus walked through the same security checkpoint where Derek Hoffman had detained him 1 year earlier. But now the checkpoint featured bias detection cameras, diversity training certificates, and passenger advocacy contact information prominently displayed. The security officers treating passengers with consistent professionalism across all racial groups. The screening times averaging equal duration regardless of passenger demographics. The additional searches genuinely random and properly documented. The complaints system accessible and responsive. Marcus approached the exact spot where Derek had accused him of fraud and demanded additional screening. A small plaque had been installed reading, "Dedicated to the principle that dignity has no color and respect recognizes no boundaries. Justice for all passengers, protection from all bias." Standing there, Marcus reflected that the plaque wasn't really about his experience. It was about every passenger who would never experience discrimination, because good people had chosen courage over comfort, accountability over denial, and justice over the status quo. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. Next flight boards in 30 minutes. Seat 2A confirmed. Marcus smiled and walked toward his gate, knowing that first class no longer meant fighting for dignity. It simply meant flying in peace as it always should have been for everyone. The victory was complete, but vigilance would be eternal. Justice, after all, was not a destination, but a journey that required constant attention and continuous courage. And at airports across America, millions of passengers would benefit from that courage every day. Most of them never knowing how close discrimination had come to being accepted as inevitable rather than eliminated as intolerable. The future of air travel was not just safer, it was fairer. And that made all the difference. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that change is possible when good people stand up, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button to show YouTube that stories about justice and courage matter. Subscribe to this channel because we're not done telling stories about people who refuse to accept discrimination as normal. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because here's the truth. Marcus Rodriguez Johnson's story isn't just about one man standing up to bias at an airport. It's about all of us choosing courage over comfort, accountability over silence, and progress over the status quo. It's about understanding that technology can serve justice, but only when good people have the courage to wield it. Share your own experiences in the comments. Have you been profiled? Have you witnessed discrimination? Have you spoken up when it mattered? Your voice matters. Your story matters. And together we can build a world where dignity isn't determined by appearance and respect isn't rationed by race. Like this video if you believe in equality. Subscribe if you believe in justice. Share if you believe in change. Because when we stand together, bias doesn't stand a chance. Thank you for watching, and remember, the future we want isn't guaranteed. It's earned. And it's earned by people who refuse to stay silent when silence serves injustice.